All right, so welcome. I appreciate you guys being here, right? This is our Tip Management 101 forum. It's sponsored by Kickfin. Today, there's a lot we've got to accomplish in 45 minutes, so we're going to go quick. I've had caffeine, so that's good. By the end, we want you to walk away with, number one, an understanding of what modern tip management strategy looks like. We'll talk about what tip management is, what a strategy can look like. We want to make sure you get some actionable tips. We talk about best practices for building a scalable system, a scalable tip program. We'll talk about that a lot. Also a compliant, we've got a lawyer here, making sure it's compliant. This is something that we're talking a lot more about over the last 5 or 10 years, which we never used to talk about. So I think it's a good conversation to have. Obviously, you guys are here for that reason. We want to make sure it works for you. Most importantly, we want to make sure it works for your team, because if it works for your team, it will work for you. 2 quick things of housekeeping. Number one, Kickfin does these really great free downloadable templates for tip pools. At the very end, make sure you stick around to the end. I'll show you how to get them. You text a number. I think we have a QR code too, and you can download them for free. They sometimes give these out. They're great. I have them. I use them. They're really terrific. So that will make sure you guys get at the very end. Hopefully, if we don't talk too much, we're going to save time for Q&A. So if there's any questions that come up over the course of this session, write them down, save them till the end. If we talk too long, which we might, or if you don't want to sort of ask your question in front of everybody, just keep your question. We're going to make sure to stick around in this room for a few minutes afterwards so you can come up and pull any one of us aside and we'll sort of cover any questions you might have. So, cool? Great. Perfect. So Tip Management 101, what every restaurant operator needs to know about building a fair, compliant, and like I said, scalable tip program. Here's the basics of what we're going to cover, right? Is tipping here to stay? This was just a question that nobody asked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and as big companies move away from it, as those big companies, some move back to it, there's a conversation around that now. So is it here to stay? Why tip management matters? Different tip distribution models, right? Because now we see more and more ways to do it. Payout methods. This is a really big thing because there's not one way to do it anymore, right? Cash, paycheck, sort of digital distribution. The digital tipping landscape, again, this is now a thing. Compliance considerations. I told you, we got a lawyer here. And then creating or recreating your tip management approach. So there's a lot we got to get to. There's a lot of sort of nuances that we'll cover as we go through there. And like I said, as we get to things, if you got questions, write them down, save them till the end. Cool? Great. So here's your panel. We are your panel. I'm going to moderate this discussion, so I'll sort of kick this off, and then I'm going to let each of these guys sort of go down and tell you who they are and why I think, or why they think they're qualified to have this conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chip Klose. I'm the host of the Restaurant Strategy Podcast. I've been in the industry for almost 24 years at this point. In addition to hosting the podcast, I'm also a restaurant coach. So I'm based out of New York City. I run a mastermind for restaurant owners and operators. I gather like 100 of them on a call every single week to help them work through profitability. We've got 3 different groups going. I work with a lot of different operators. I think that's the unique perspective that I bring to this conversation. I've been doing this for a long time, and so I'm excited to sort of throw it back and forth to these guys. That's me. Let's go down the line. Brian, kick us off.
Hey, thanks, Chip. Brian Hassan, I'm co-CEO of Kickfin. We're the largest digital tips payout platform in the United States, working with anybody from SMB to enterprise.
Ken McGarrie, Korgen Hospitality, a restaurant consulting group out of Chicago, several dozen clients, and author of The Surprise Restaurant Manager.
Which is so good.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Mike Manley. I am the Senior Director of Store Systems with both Dave & Buster's and Main Events.
Hey everyone, I'm Jim Fessenden. I'm a partner with Phillips. It's an employment defense law firm, so we defend companies and advise companies on employment issues. And my parents also own 2 restaurants too, so I know the industry well.
Perfect. So when we were all putting together the panel, right, the beauty here is that Brian gets to peek behind the curtain from a lot of different companies, right, gets a unique perspective. I think that's your unique value. Same thing with Ken, working with a lot of different companies, a lot of different kinds of companies, right? Mike, sort of working at this industry leader, you know, sort of understanding how the big guys do it. That's something I'm always interested in. And then, like I said, we got the lawyer here. So to understand we're doing it the way it's supposed to be done. So we thought really deeply about the panel that we were putting together to make sure it worked for you guys and you guys could has as comprehensive a conversation as possible. Cool? Shall we dig in? Cool. So here's that first question. You saw this. We talked about it, right? Is tipping here to stay? This is a question I don't think we had to ask, or no one thought to ask X number of years ago, right? But this is now something we talk about. I think we can probably all agree, at least for now, tipping is a pretty big part of the American restaurant culture. And for good reason, right? So you see here, right? Tip-friendly culture allows restaurants and bars to pay workers far more than what revenue constraints allow. I don't have to tell you this, but the restaurant industry is cost-intensive, typically low margin. And so any help we can get, tipping sort of helps us do that with the tip credit and things like that, helps us keep that down. It also helps our people make more money, and we know that. And there's significant data that shows that they make more when the consumer sort of pays them at the end of the meal. Tips have significantly increased the earning potential of hospitality workers. We talk about essential workers. I think we learned that over the pandemic. They are essential. We like going out. We need to go out. We can't always cook for ourselves. That's a big part of it, making sure they're taken care of. Most importantly, and this is, and I know the sort of staffing issues have been a big deal over the last, let's say, 3 years, right? Overwhelmingly, our workers are pro-tipping. And I think it's for all these reasons, because they make more. So if we can help them have a job that they like and situations and circumstances that they like, ultimately that will help us attract and retain people. And I think we understand that. There's certainly nuances and sophistications that are coming that we will talk about. Mike, talk to me about sort of what you guys do. So talk about the benefits of building a tip-friendly environment. You guys do it. Have you ever gone away from it? Have you ever thought of going away from it? Talk to me about that.
Sure. So we have not given any consideration to going away from tipping. When it comes to the restaurant side of the business, if you're not familiar with our concepts for restaurant and entertainment, when it comes to the restaurant side of the business, tipping is there to stay. There's no conversation about that going away. Since we are a multifaceted operation with both the restaurant and hospitality, the whole experience is just so important that we are giving our guests the absolute best experience. They've come for a fun time. And by making sure that our servers understand the importance of service and that they are getting judged on that by the amount that they're going to get tipped out or tipped at the end of that meal, that's just one way that we can make sure that they are getting the best experience possible.
Yeah, for sure. Ken, sort of jump right on that because, again, Mike works sort of this big industry leader, this giant. You work with a bunch of different companies. So do you feel like that's also what you're seeing as well? Is there another perspective you want to add into this?
Completely. At this point, most of the concepts I'm aligned with are also not looking at doing any sort of elimination of tipping. As tip credit from city to city begins to make adjustments, then that's a larger conversation about how service charges are going to come into play. But overarchingly, still that tip model seems to be what everyone is going to.
Yeah, for sure. So when we go through this, there are three main areas that I think we want to cover over this, right? So number one, the tip pool share model, right? Tip pooling, tip sharing, those are different. We're going to get into how they're different. Specifically, we're talking about how we're collecting and combining the tips and then how we're distributing them, how we're divvying up the pool or the pile. Number two, the payout method. Actually, how are the employees receiving tips? Again, this is a conversation we didn't have 10 years ago, not even like 7 years ago. That's a consideration. And then systems and tech. So what tools are you using to ensure that your strategy is, again, compliant, accurate, and again, scalable? This is the word I keep coming back with because I think growth is on a lot of our minds. Making sure we can do it efficiently and effectively and that it can work as we continue to grow. So again, we talk about a tip management strategy. Why does it matter? How is it changing? And how does it impact operations? Those are the questions we want to ask. So Brian, talk to me, I sort of hinted at this, right? But talk to me about why tip management is such a hot topic right now and why are operators sort of reevaluating their tipping programs? Because it's been in the news a lot over the last couple of years.
It's a hot topic because as you see companies scale from SMB and enterprise, what you're actually coming across is locations that are using different tip pools, tip shares, different rules. We've come across enterprises that give it to the GM and say you can implement these tipping rules, and what happens is these restaurants take off and they're very successful, but now they've incorporated a ton of these tip pool, tip share debt, where nothing's really unified. So we see a lot of heads nodding here because it's in fact true, and these are some very well-respected brands that have this challenge. So I think like simplifying and unifying that sooner rather than later is very important. Also thinking about the ways you're actually paying out your team. So thinking about the growth of credit card transactions happening, meaning there's less cash on hand, but what COVID's taught is that people want their money now. Like labor, you're competing with Uber and Lyft and other gig platforms for that same kind of labor pool, give or take. And then finally looking at ways to automate all of this. So looking at for solutions that actually integrate, automate, and calculate payouts. So kind of wrapping all those three things into one is a great way of like really looking at your tipping program. So from one end of the spectrum, we've got 40 stores, we're doing it 40 different ways, we're doing it in cash with armored car that maybe sometimes shows up and my payroll team hates me, to like how can we go ahead and kind of move over here, or to just take baby steps. So I think we see a lot of organizations now really reflecting back, and I think like the real motivator is not necessarily the unifying of the tip policies, but more so with the lack of cash in circulation is forcing the hand of the operator to really take a hard look at this issue.
Yeah, so something you had mentioned, and I've heard you say it before, and I love when you put it this way. You said, in a lot of ways, it's the final frontier, right? That people have reevaluated their POS, their reservations, their inventory, their scheduling. And again, this is not something we ever had to think about, but that now that there is a consideration here, how we do it, how we distribute it, how we make it happen for our employees. And I think this really comes at an interesting inflection point at a time when it's really hard to attract and retain employees. I think that's why we're talking about it.
Yep. And Chip, you made a really great point there. So we start talking about employees, right? So the restaurants that are disintermediating cash, they're disintermediating cash by streaming funds directly to the employee's bank account, not putting on a third-party prepaid card, sort of legacy solutions that have been around for maybe about a decade or so. And so we start thinking about the benefits of safety and security, accountability, tracking. Those are big benefits, but every employee has Square, Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, and these apps, none of them want a new bank account. So when you're looking at something that's more employee-friendly, it's certainly a consideration. And that's why we've seen, the early adopters of like prepaid cards were like Darden Group. They recognized the problem. They had the foresight to see that cash was shrinking. So Darden employed a pay card approach, but we'll have to thank the likes of Lyft and Uber for educating the market on there's a better, more modern way of doing it. And so certain considerations that'll really make it easier to administer, but also still at the same time making it employee friendly. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, for sure. I always talk about this, right? Like, I always think of technology, right? And we're at the right conference to talk about this. Like technology is like a wave, right? Progress only moves in one direction. Of course, we know that. But like you're either at the forefront of the wave, surfing the wave, sort of succeeding because of it, or you get crushed by the wave. Like the wave just crashes over you. And this has been very obvious over the last couple of years that this is now a consideration. Again, people who went away from tipping went back to tipping. People who have done the cards, people who have done it in the paychecks, and have done digital solutions and all that. Now it's a consideration, and if we want to attract and retain employees, it's a thing. Jim, I think it's time we go to you.
I do have a few thoughts on that.
Yeah.
A couple things. So to piggyback on your point, it's not just a good operational strategy to have a unified strategy. It's also probably going to make you more legally compliant because my firm has handled more than a handful of lawsuits where a company has a pretty well-written policy. They probably paid some lawyer to write it, and it hits all the bells and whistles and says everything it's supposed to say. And they even shuttled it out to the right managers, and then a manager figures something out or wants to tweak something or wants to customize something, and they kind of go rogue. Not thinking they're going rogue, they don't think they're doing anything wrong, they don't think they're doing anything mean-spirited, but what they are doing isn't technically compliant. And so we've defended a lot of lawsuits where the genesis is a GM who didn't necessarily have the right training, didn't have the right infrastructure in place, went rogue and did something. And those are a variety called a wage and hour class action. They're very expensive. They're a pain to defend. They're expensive to defend. Not much of the money goes to the employees, by the way, if you're curious. Most of the money ends up going to the attorneys, of course. But they're a real pain to defend. You don't want to deal with them. So having a unified strategy is also going to help you legally too. I can't help it. I have to say I don't like pay cards legally. I think there's a pretty compelling argument that when you force an employee to do pay cards, there's a pretty compelling argument that's not compliant. And no one likes to hear that, but that is my honest assessment. And they're definitely not compliant if you're charging fees. And that's true. That's not just a California thing or something like that. There's sometimes where I say you can do X, Y, and Z, and you can't do anything even close to that in California. But that's actually my advice in all 50 states right now.
Yeah. Ken, how are you seeing people sort of shift their mindset, their approach to this with your clients specifically?
So specifically, being able to have something that is quick and like popping up on their bank account immediately has been a saving grace, simply because the old cash model, to where you go to the bank, you bring $20,000, you can't afford to have a Brinks truck come, so you're literally just walking down the street with it, and then you're cutting up the cash, putting in envelopes, and then somebody comes by 3 days later and says, I got cheated $20. It's cash. You have no way of making sure that it's
good
all.
point.
And so because of that, and anytime that happens, it breaks the trust with your team, because it looks like that you're trying to get over on them. So from my standpoint, one of the biggest aspects of being able to do that is that when it pops into your account at that exact moment, you can say, yep, that's exactly what I'm expecting to have, not a dollar more or less.
I would say you can do a lot with the employees. You can't mess with their money. You can't. I mean, and we sort of know that, and people sort of laugh, but like,
100%.
You can't. We don't want to. That's where it gets. That's where it gets ugly. Okay, let's go into sort of the first pillar here, right? First pillar of this tip management strategy: tip pooling versus tip sharing. So the vast majority of restaurants, I think, do one version of this or the other. We're going to talk about specifically. I want to define this, what it is. So Jim, talk to me. Tip sharing, tip pooling. Let's make sure we get really clear that we're talking about the right thing.
Sure, and I will tell you that there are people who've told me that they have a different definition, but what I've always understood tip pooling to be, tip pooling is where you're pooling all the tips usually based on hours worked. Sometimes there's a point system, but it's something where all the tips are being pooled collectively by typically the front of the house staff. Tip sharing is where you're supposed to designate a percentage that goes out from each individual person's tips to the bartender, hopefully not to the back of the house currently, at least if you're taking a tip credit. But sometimes that is how some people do tip sharing.
Yeah. So tip sharing is right. What we know is that, hey, I'm a server. I make X number of dollars, and I tip out certain percentage to the runners, certain percentage to the bussers, certain percentage to the bartenders. And I think we know that. And then, of course, the other thing is that tip pool where everything goes together and sort of divvies up in one way or another. Brian, talk me through some of that. What are the most common ways to do that, to collect? What are some of the most common ways to divvy that up then?
Yeah, so we see typically in like the quick service restaurant environment, it's very vanilla. It's an hours worked tip pool, so a certain amount of dollars received in a day, hours worked in a day, and you get your pro rata share of that tip pool based on hours worked. When we get into full service, it's a little bit more complex. We see fine dining a lot of the times using points-based systems. So they're assigning a point value to a specific role, and as you accumulate those points, you then divide up the tip pool. The most common, and actually, interestingly enough, this is where we see a ton of deviation between different locations as companies scale up, is like the tip share model, where they're like, hey, we're going to go 90%, you keep 90%, 5% goes to the bartender, 3% to the busser, and 2% goes to the host. And I hope that adds up to 100, but no guarantees. But what we find, though, in that being the most common, is that as more stores are added, GMs would incentivize or change the percentages because they feel somebody's worked a little harder or incentivizing. And now what's happening is giving them that flexibility is not keeping in compliance with the agreed upon tip share policies that the employees have signed off on. So I find that with the latter, when we talk about splitting percentages in the tip share model, is where we see the most non-compliant compliance happening. But those are three of the most common. Obviously, QSR hours work simplest, but it just doesn't work in the full service environment. Furthermore, we also have clients that actually split off net sales. So they'll say, hey, listen, we're going to actually not actually split the amount of tips received, but we're going to drive it off of net sales. We'll even break it down even further, and we'll pull discounts out of those particular sales categories, so on and so forth, because there's higher margin items that they want their servers to push. So many permutations, tons of different algorithms, tons of different approaches. We say simpler is better, and actually like starting with a specific plan and maintaining that plan and educating your GMs not to deviate from that is helpful.
Mike, what do you guys do at D&B and main events?
Yeah, so for both D&B and main event, our bartenders will pool their tips. Since they're all working behind the same bar, they'll pool together, and based upon hours worked, they'll split that up. Interestingly enough, we have two different models for tip sharing. in that at D&B, the servers are tip sharing out to the server assistants, bussers and such, bartenders. Whereas at Main Event, we don't have any tip sharing. So we just pay the positions differently, and there's no tip sharing amongst them.
And how, that's just been years of getting to that place. Is there any particular reason why one works at one place and the other one, and that wouldn't work? Do you know what I mean?
So, just a little bit of history. We merged the two companies about a year and a half ago, and so it's just historic how the two companies have always done it. And there's been no discussion about merging those models. I have no doubt that that will happen as we merge all of our operations together, that there will be conversations about that. But this is just kind of the way that things have happened over the years.
Yeah. All right. Ken, talk to us about the pros of each, the cons of each.
The pros of each, I mean, I understand the model of being able to set something out and saying you're tipping out 5% to the bar and 4% to the runner and busser. But to Jim's point, I can't tell you the number of companies that I work with that 90 days out, they realize that they're paying the busser $200 and they're paying the runner $20. So to your point, they make those adjustments without making sure that that's compliant within communication. So being able to have that structure that is concrete, that is set, and then is communicated straightforward, which is why it's so important that those open door communications are there.
Yep.
Simply so that people have the conversation of, if it happens to go off the rails, this is what we're going to do in 30 days.
It's so funny. I always think about like tip sharing versus tip pooling, because I've worked with clients and brought them over to a tip pool, likewise the opposite. And people always say, no, the servers are going to complain. I was like, servers are going to complain no matter what. Right? Because we do a tip share, right? And everyone's like, why did that person get an extra table? Like, I need the next table, right? They're going to be at the front podium complaining that way. Likewise, the opposite happens. We do a tip pool and say, why do they get that extra table? Jim's over there. Jim hasn't had, right? They're going to complain either way. And I think there are considerations on both sides, and I think worth sort of going through the exercise.
Absolutely.
But doing it or not doing it because somebody's going to complain, a server's going to complain, is not the reason to do it or not. Jim, when we were setting up for this, you brought up something really interesting on one of our Zoom calls. Chime in about smoke breaks, because I think this is really interesting, and I think they'll get a lot out of it.
Yeah, so believe it or not, there are entire class action. First of all, I should premise this by saying, keep in mind, there's a whole cottage industry of lawyers who want to sue restaurants based on hyper-technicalities. So that's point A. Point B is one of those theories is that if you have employees on smoke breaks, that they go out there, they shouldn't be accounted for in their hours that are tallied up for purposes of getting tips, because they say it's unfair to the people who are not smokers, I should say. They're getting cheated out of their fair share on a tip pool. So believe it or not, that is a whole basis for a kind of a up-and-coming class action. We've seen more than a few of them. Which
sort of makes sense when you sort of follow it through. You're like, that guy gets 5 minutes every hour. Like,
right.
But I'm working 60 minutes out of the hour. That guy's working 55 minutes.
There is logic to it, absolutely.
Yeah,
I don't want to give any credit to plaintiffs' attorneys, but there is logic to it.
Cool. All right, so moving on to the second pillar of the strategy, right? So once you figured out how you're going to collect the tips, how you're going to combine them, how you're going to then split them up, the next step is figuring out how you're going to divide them up. You guys can read this. Brian, walk us through what's on this slide. So cash, payroll, digital, different ways of divvying it up. Talk to me about the pros and cons.
Yeah, so cash, we talk to a lot of operators and they say, I'm still doing it the old way with cash and like it's a bad thing. But the reality is according to Visa data, 90% of hospitality outlets are still paying it out in cash. So in fact, while it may be perceived as the old school way, it's a far dominant way. And Visa mentioned that in June of last year in an earnings report. So cash is dominant. Challenge with that is there's not enough inbound. So what we've seen is if you're doing north of $5 million in sales, you're using Brinks or Loomis to deliver the cash. And if they show up or not, that's another question. Sub $5 million, you run to the bank to pick up cash. And I mean, the genesis of our company was we met with somebody that had about $7,000 in her purse on Divisadero in San Francisco. And that actually made me uncomfortable because I don't even carry $20 in my wallet on Divisadero. So cash is still pretty dominant, but employees like it. The old school way of thinking about it was the employees liked it because they didn't have to pay taxes on it. Well, the reality is given point of sale reporting now and what the departments of labor in any city state are doing is they're looking at POS data and they're saying, hey, what's tips claimed against actually like tips paid out? And they're not going after the employee, they're going after the employer because guess who has the money to pay? The employer does, not the employee. So what we found in the last, call it, like 9, 12 months is that issue or that question is not coming up as much. Payroll's super easy. I started my sales career at ADP. When I actually started this business, I actually asked a bartender at a water bar, I said, when the Loomis truck pulled up, and I said, why don't you just put it on payroll? And he looked at me like I was an idiot. My mother was a waitress and my father was a GM, so I should have known better. When I recall my childhood, my mom counting the dollar bills on our dining room table, he said, if they put it on payroll, I'm walking across the street and working a boulevard. I want it right away, and that's just the way it has been. And this is specifically important in states that are $2.13 an hour, like Texas, for example, where a lion's share of your earnings is daily. And now with the competitive pressures of Uber and Lyft and gig platforms paying daily, it becomes significantly more important to pay it out in cash, right away, not on payroll. Benefits of payroll, though, are, if you're offering 401k, if you're offering benefits, if you're doing things like that, there's certainly a benefit to that, but there are actually software solutions out there that can actually allow you to split payroll and instant. That'll afford you the ability to actually get the benefits of doing the benefit deductions, but still paying it out in real time. Now we move over to digital. I mentioned Darden Group before. I think they were the pioneers in digital payouts, and they partnered with the US Bank and issued the prepaid cards for their employees because they had the foresight to see that cash was shrinking. But they're at monster scale, so they were able to deploy it quite successfully, and it's Darden, right? They've got the people in the apps. But as we started looking at digital, we really look at sort of like two options. We look at the prepaid card solutions out there. There's tons of players doing it. You can stand those solutions up relatively quickly. Challenge with those is that the modern employee, they want their money directly in their bank account. They don't want money on another card or a gift card, and they don't want to be restricted to like 2 ATM networks that are only in Walgreens and Costco. And so at the end of the day, when we look at the other digital options like that, I keep going back to Lyft and Uber. They were the pioneers. So Lyft and Uber said, let's stream this directly to our drivers' bank accounts, and let's use this as a recruitment and retention tool. And Lyft did this before Uber. And as a result, Uber followed suit 2 years later because they realized that streaming funds directly to their drivers' accounts was a tremendous recruitment tool for them. So when you look at digital as an option, there's certainly legacy pay card solutions out there and some newer players that are just kind of wrapping a nice UI on an old school pay card. But certainly points of consideration are, let's look at who you're competing with from a labor perspective, and let's look at how they're doing it, and let's kind of understand why they're doing it that way. But those are really the 4 options: is cash, payroll, like legacy pay cards, and then like streaming directly into bank accounts.
I think it's interesting. In a previous slide, it said, 88% of, here's the power of Kickfin, is you guys have access to a lot of data. So 88% of all people on Kickfin were doing either a share or a pool, right? That's big. And then here, 90%, this is crazy, 90% of hospitality employers continue to pay out tips in cash. And it's like a safety concern. It's an inefficiency. When we look at the hours and all that to divvy them up and all of that, it's crazy. Mike, so fewer people carrying cash. It's an increasingly cashless society. Specifically, how does that relate to tips and how you guys think about tips?
Yeah, so first of all, on the reduction in use of cash out there, when we look at the amount of cash that's being taken in, we have stores up in the 30% range that are 30% cash, and then we have stores that are literally at 1%. And so in order to pay those cash tips at the end of the night, those stores are actually withdrawing money from the bank just to be able to pay the tips out. We're negative cash in those stores. So it really does have an impact. So the ability to pay digitally is very enticing to us as we look at where the society is going. So we actually have one store, one main event that we've taken and made it a cashless store completely. So guests must pay by card. If you don't have if you don't have a card, then you get a prepaid card when you enter by using a cash to card machine. And then everything from there on out is cashless, including how we tip, how we pay the tips out to our servers and staff through the Kickfin technology.
So Jim, talk to me just briefly about sort of the compliance and the legal issues around that being totally cashless, because I love the idea, having managed restaurants for a while, being alone in a restaurant late at night with a sort of a heavy drawer by the end. Not thrilled about that, and I assume a lot of people sort of that resonates with them. But then you hear sometimes, people get sued for this or not sued. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, the main one is if you're forcing people to use a pay card, a prepaid pay card as your only alternative, that can get you into some trouble. That's why I don't like it. The other is if you're charging fees on that pay card, even if it's an alternative, and you're charging a fee to get people to get their cash, that'll get you in trouble 100 times out of 100. Obviously, there's a reason cash is king. That one is always going to be legally compliant, and even in places like California, you can always issue through payroll. But it's by the way, if anyone really wants to get esoteric about it, I think there's actually a pretty compelling argument that pay cards should be legal. It's just that I don't have enough support to actually tell you that they actually are legal. I think there's compelling arguments to be made. But in any case, it's really forcing someone to do something they don't want to do in terms of a pay card. It's the fees. Those are really your two big issues.
So great, I love it. And we've talked about a bunch of them, but talk about like the costs, right? Like the cons of sort of like cash, and this is probably for the whole group. And we talked about sort of the inefficiency of it, sort of the theft, I think safety. Are there any others that we haven't hit yet? Those are big ones.
One of the big things that I would run into often is that when you did have those times that are less than 1% cash, you're literally, a lot of the POSs are set to where it will claim all of your credit card tips as tips and shoot into payroll. And if you're tipping out a certain amount of that, you're actually not bringing that home.
Yeah.
And again, that's a mistrust immediately with staff to where they're like, everything that I rang tonight is on credit card, but now it's going to say that I made this much and I'm tipping out X amount.
Yep.
And that, when I'm paying out cash, that's what's going to happen.
It's like you don't think about it until you get there, right?
Yeah. Well, until somebody brings it up to you.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else we haven't hit there? No? Great. That's moving out. So, right, this third pillar, this digital tipping solution. So, Brian, walk me through this because this is what you do, digital tipping. So what options are on the table? We talked about a couple of them, but what options are on the table for distribution and stuff?
Yeah, so we talked about, we talked about cash, payroll, prepaid cards. We talked about streaming directly to bank of choice. So when you're actually looking at a digital tipping solution, you want to be looking at a few things typically. So that means we've already kind of shelved cash. We want to be looking at, does this platform, how can I deploy this platform? Does this platform connect with POS, HCM, or does it work unintegrated? You should have a menu of all options. You should have a company that actually, on one hand, connects to POS and runs the calculations and does the payouts for you. On the other hand, you should have the option, if you have legacy POS, to actually deploy this in an unintegrated fashion just to disintermediate cash. We have some large enterprise brands, for example, using our platform fully unintegrated. We have other brands using our platform, integrating with POS, us running the calculations and doing the payouts. Integrations, like who are they talking to? Are they talking to micros? Are they talking to NCR? Are they talking to Toast? On the payroll side, do we need payroll connectivity? Do we want this to push directly into ADP Run or Workforce Now, Paylocity, or do we want our accounting team to look at it? So I think when we're looking at like a digital tipping solution, let's first identify, like in triage, what's most important. And typically what's most important is getting rid of cash. Okay, cool. What's now that's solving 80%. All right, now how can I create some efficiencies? All right, why don't we now look at tying this into point of sale and running the calculations? Okay, that provides some benefit. Great, get out of the spreadsheets. And third, now let's talk about like payroll and tax compliance. Will this actually data push directly into my payroll platform? And so into the correct earnings code so that they're taxed correctly. And then you have the full end-to-end. My advice though is when you're looking at digital tipping solutions is, this is from like the Texas restaurant show. We talked to somebody, he's like, don't over-tech the tech. Meaning like a lot of the times you talk to one vendor that you need one like solution. You need the refrigerator, not the entire kitchen remodel. So like you don't need everything all at once. Start with what you need first and then kind of build around that, go forward. I think that's a great solution. And hey, for some people, I need to actually get out from under the spreadsheet first. And for other people, it's like, listen, literally, like I cannot deal with cash anymore. And usually it's the latter. But looking at a solution or an option that can actually handle the payroll compliance, variety of payout models, integrations, calculations, and so forth, I think is the best way to look at a platform.
I think this industry, it's such a cool point to be in this industry with all the solutions that are coming about, because it wasn't that long ago where I could think of like the before and the after. Like I said at the beginning, like there's just stuff we never thought to ask and that we could ask, that we could change it. Mike, you can look at the before and after for how you guys used to do it and how you guys do it now.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so at that one store that's gone cashless that we're doing everything digital, the employee satisfaction with it is through the roof. So with change, we all know that, everyone's going to be against it at first. So when they first heard we were converting the store to cashless, it was, we're going to lose our guests, we're not going to get our money in time, all the what ifs. None of that panned out. The guests have no problem with it because we're not charging the guest any fees to convert their cash to card. That's all on us as a business. We're not charging our employees any fees for getting their tips digitally. They have the option. So as Jim has pointed out, you shouldn't force them just to cards. We didn't. Through the Kickfin technology, we can go either to their bank account or if they're unbanked, then to a card. So it's completely the employee's choice. People actually do still have bank accounts out there, so that is important. And so the satisfaction is just great. We did a survey of them about 3 months after we converted to the cashless tipping. And that was a number one reason for why they wanted to stay as an employee there, was because they loved that benefit. They loved the fact that they're not walking out at risk when they leave the building at night. Yet by the time they're in their car, they can look at their P card or look at the bank account, whatever it is, and the money's there. They can go spend it just like they used to spend it. They're not waiting for it at all, but it's at no risk to them.
They can still go blow it at the bar.
That's right.
I waited tables for many years. So Ken, we come from the ops background.
Yep.
Talk to me about, sort of the employee adoption and all of that. Talk to me about from the management side. Talk to me about that.
Absolutely. So from a manager standpoint, I think that first off, the ease of not counting cash and just putting in numbers. I'm not a big fan of integration when it comes to this. I like having the manager be able to look at it at the end of the night, put it in, because you are pulling from an account that has X amount of money in it. So I do like to have that sort of interaction.
I love that.
It's a very important aspect. The other thing is, and quite honestly, most of my servers or bartenders that work in the restaurants I'm associated with make far more than the managers. That, I'm telling you nothing that nobody knows. So being able to literally put out hundreds of dollars and hand it to your servers every night psychologically begins to get with you. And it's one of those things to where there's a disconnection to where you're like, because I'm a big proponent of, if you're a restaurant manager, what are you doing to move yourself beyond that? Because, that disparity there. So when you're sitting there with however many thousands of dollars and you're paying it out to your staff and you're a brand new restaurant manager, it'll screw with you. So I like being able to put it on a thing through Kickfin.
It's so funny. One of the things that I always talk about with the clients that I work with is that a manager's job is to manage for profitability. And we sort of lose sight of that because they're caught up in all these things, right?
Of course.
Unlock the doors, turn out the lights, do the bank drop, do, triage in the dining room and comps and voids and all of this stuff and paying out.
Right.
But really, when we free them up of that, they can actually focus on sort of scheduling and hours and our, labor percentages and really managing for the profitability, which I think is ultimately where we want them to get to.
That's how they elevate. Yeah, absolutely.
That's
And
to
that's
your
how
point,
that's how they move on the next.
that's how they move on to the next thing, because
Exactly.
they start understanding sort of the ecosystem of a restaurant, why a restaurant exists or should exist. Okay, I know there was a lawyer on here for some reason. Tip management and compliance, Jim. You're gonna take this whole thing one by one. What's the tip credit?
That is a law that says that restaurants and other tip professions can take a credit against the minimum wage for up to, I think it's $5.13. The total minimum wage, $7.25 an hour. You can take a little over $5 of that as a tip credit. It only applies to tipped employees, though. And there's some other complications too, which I think you get into a second here. If we're going to do tip sharing or tip pooling, you can only include people in the tip share who are getting the full $7.25 minimum wage. If anyone is taking a tip credit in that tip share or that tip pool, you can no longer take the tip credit, which means you're paying that full minimum wage for all hours worked.
Great. Now it's going to get a little murky. So, tip pools, can they be mandatory?
Yes.
Yes. Who can participate in a tip pool as long as they're at minimum wage?
Yeah, it's only the people who are traditionally tipped. So that's basically going to be your front of the house, and that's it. And a lot of people know you can't include managers. What a lot of people don't know is that managers isn't just the GM. Managers, I don't want to get too wonky here, but the DOL likes to have different definitions depending on what favors them. And so in certain cases, manager to the DOL means someone who's really high up, like a general manager. But in other cases, and including in tip pooling and tip credits, manager means anyone who can do interviewing, hiring, firing, disciplining, training even. So we're talking like a shift lead is arguably a manager for tip credit purposes, and that's a really big deal because if that's true, all of a sudden that means someone like a shift lead should not be part of a tip credit or a tip pool, which is insane, and I know no one likes to hear that, but that is the way the law is currently stated.
Great. It's super important because now we get into all kind, and you're in California, so now with back of house participating in some places and stuff, can we talk briefly about back of house participation?
Sure, and I should have even said that you can't do tip credits. I think it's 7 states where you cannot have tip credits at all. You go right up the left coast. It's California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Nevada, Montana, Minnesota. Did I miss it? You guys might know better than I do, but I think I got them all.
And pretty soon maybe New York and New Jersey
right,
on
they've
the
both
right
have
coast.
bills pending, for it. So that might be going away in those states too. But yeah, if you want to have back of the house, the bottom line is everyone has to get at least the minimum wage for that state. So federally $7.25 in California. I think we're up to, depending on which city you're in, I think we're up to $17 now in certain cities in Northern California.
$16.30, I think, going to $16.80 at the end of the year.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
It is.
It's a lot.
It is. And so if you want to have back of the house, everyone has to be getting that statutory minimum wage. Not a big deal in California because we don't have a tip credit anyway, so everyone has to get the statutory minimum wage. It doesn't prevent people, by the way, from truly voluntarily, giving out their tips to the back of the house. I mean, I was a server in college, and I always gave something to the back of the house because I felt like that's what you have to do, even though we didn't have to. But I think you have to if you want to keep your back of the house happy. You probably should. Voluntary is a key word there.
I say this a lot, and for what it's worth, doing what I do, I spend a lot of time looking to what California's doing because I think what's happening over there is sort of the recipe and sort of like the blueprint for what probably or could be happening in other states. I just think it's a good idea to keep an eye on what really smart owners and operators are doing out there, for what it's worth, and it's directly as it relates to this and how it affects our payroll cost. Last one here, if I put my tips on payroll, am I technically withholding wages?
So that gets into a complicated question. So your only obligation is to withhold wages that are technically declared, and just because you are payrolling their tips does not automatically mean those tips are declared. The big asterisk that goes with that is that the IRS has issued guidance to restaurants basically saying that we're going to assume that your employees are all going to automatically declare a certain percentage of their tips. They don't do it in other industries. So like valets at a hotel, those are all heavily tipped, but the IRS guidance doesn't apply to them. It does apply to most restaurants, and you will have to treat a certain percentage as taxed.
Now, that's the really sexy stuff, so. But that's, I think it's good. We've got 1 minute left, so I want to roll through tip management best practices, determine the right model and method for your restaurant. So, Brian, kick us off. Best practices.
Yeah, best practices, typically, QSRs, hours-based, fine dining points-based, and then full-service restaurants, we're typically doing like tip shares, but keeping it unified. It's kind of the theme today. A lot of nodding heads that theirs aren't unified. So that's probably a great takeaway from the session. Look what your local market's doing. Like I mentioned that story about the origin of Kickfin is when I talked to the bartender at Water Bar, and he had mentioned that, if you put tips on payroll, I'm going to go work at Boulevard across the street. So know the local market. Like, interestingly enough, New York City, huge payroll tipping market. DC, huge payroll tipping market. Austin, Dallas, huge cash markets. Houston, cash markets. So know the market, because there are some markets you can get away with certain payout methods and others you can't. And then tech stack. Like, to Ken's point, Fabio Viviani and a lot of his clients like unintegrated to where they can just really eliminate the need of dealing with cash and cash only, whereas other clients of ours are looking for like a fully integrated experience connecting to POS all the way to payroll with us running the calculations for them. So I think that's important, identifying maybe also if you want to be here ultimately, but start with baby steps with solving the biggest pain point first.
Jim, this is all you, man.
Especially if you're going to issue a tip credit policy. By the way, there's 2 kinds of notices that might be captured in there. One is if you're going to use that tip credit, it's not just a tip. You have to have a policy. You have to put the employee on notice if you're taking a tip credit. That is the single easiest class action you can get hit with, is if you fail to provide the magical written notice. But the other thing, even if you are not taking a tip credit and you're going to have a tip pooling policy, you do want, or a tip sharing or tip pooling policy, you got to have something in writing. You want that spelled out. Like I said, the rogue manager that I had that got one of my clients sued, that came down to an index card that he delivered that said a lot of things it shouldn't have said. But you want to have one centralized
That's another
policy.
session.
Yeah.
That's great. Ken.
So absolute, the open door policy going to exactly what we're talking about whenever there needs to be adjustments, that you're following the pattern. And then most importantly, you're using this technology and this platform in order to strengthen the managers and staff versus making it adversarial.
That's the whole key to this thing, right? Is, again, I said it earlier, don't mess with their money. Just that's what keeps them really happy. Mike, talk about sort of leveraging technology.
Yeah, so the key points have already been said. I'll just restate them to highlight them. So the flexibility to do the card versus the bank accounts, fees charged back to the company so you're not impacting your servers, and then the immediacy of getting them their money that night.
Yeah, I love it. All right, Brian, bring us home.
Don't overcomplicate, but overcommunicate. Like we said with these tip policies, it's crazy. This is the business. We do this for thousands of restaurants, and they send us their spreadsheets, and we started looking at these things. I mean, I got one, it's funny, I got one from Sport Clips, actually, not even in this industry. And their tip share spreadsheet was more complicated than any restaurant tip share spreadsheet I've seen. So don't overcomplicate, keep it simple, and find the right tools to keep it simple at the end of the day. And make sure your employees know, over-communication is key.
So here's the thing I promised, right? They have these tip pooling templates. They're so great. I've been doing this for so long, and I rip these. If you text pool to that number, 33777, you can get the templates. They'll just be sent right to you. I promised you I was probably going to talk too long, even though I had coffee and I would speak fast. And we are at time, but we are not going anywhere. So if you guys have questions, by all means, we can sit here. If you guys want to come up, that's totally fine, because I know there are other sessions that start in about 15 minutes. So thank you guys for being here. Really appreciate it. I hope you got something out of this. And we look forward to seeing you over the next couple of days at the show.